Good evening. Welcome to our History at Night program at San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site. We're very excited that you would join us tonight. I'm going to do a little housekeeping to give people time to get filtered in, to choose the best seat on their couch or wherever they may be watching from tonight. So apologies that we're still not in a world where we could do this in person, but you may gather myself and our great speaker tonight, Judge Ken Wise. We're both here at the museum. We got a chance to kick the tires and tour a little bit. He hadn't been here in a while, but as a longtime stakeholder, we were happy to have him out and thrilled to have him participate with us tonight in our third episode, our third edition of season 2 of the History at Night program. Like I said, still virtual, so bear with us. In terms of housekeeping for the program, it really works well for us to use the chat feature for Q&A at the end. So I encourage any of you who have a question, who are motivated by something as we go through our session tonight, fire away, type your chat into that space if you know how to use that feature. And we're not going to interrupt for questions, but we'll organize questions and try to get as many processed as we can at the end of the program. So again, here we are with Judge Ken Wise, and he hosts a wonderful podcast. You may have seen that slide. There we are. The Wise About Texas podcast. And one of the things we love about Ken, obviously he's a great legal mind, but he's also a great history mind. So he's one of our people. And it's always fun to engage people who are doing their own research and learning new and wonderful things to share in Texas history. I usually do some pretty quick editing on bios and keep them pretty short, but Ken's got such an illustrious career up to now. Bear with me while I go through a quick bio on him so that those of you who don't know Ken and his work can get a sense of what he's bringing to the table tonight. Justice Ken Wise was appointed to the 14th Court of Appeals by Governor Rick Perry in October of 2013, after previously serving as the judge of the 334th Judicial District Court and the 152nd Judicial District Court in Harris County. Justice Wise earned his bachelor's degree from Texas A&M University, where he also competed as a member of the Intercollegiate Rodeo Team. That's its own future History at Night program, but for tonight, we're going to stick with the big topics. Justice Wise is very active in the service of the bar and the judiciary. He co-chaired a state bar task force that conducted the first complete study of the Texas court system since 1892. He serves as a commissioner on the Texas Access to Justice Commission. He's also served as a visiting judge in counties across the state of Texas. Justice Wise has also been elected to membership in the prestigious American Law Institute. And here again, as our people, Justice Wise is an avid Texas historian. He hosts the award-winning Texas history podcast, Wise About Texas, which has over 700,000 downloads in more than 139 countries worldwide. He's an adjunct professor of history and government at Houston Baptist University. He's written several journal articles, given dozens of speeches on all aspects of Texas history. Justice Wise serves on the State Historian Committee, the Archives Committee, and the McNeil Fellowship Committees of the Texas State Historical Association. He's a trustee of the Texas Supreme Court Historical Society and a member of the Supreme Court Task Force on Historic Court Record Preservation. He's also a member of the Delegados Associate Board of the Bryan Museum in Galveston, Texas. A native Houstonian, Justice Wise is very active in that community. He's a director of the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo and serves as an advisory director of the former Texas Ranger Foundation. In 2015, the governor of Kentucky commissioned Justice Wise as a Kentucky colonel, which also sounds like a fun story. Ken is a 5th generation native Texan with roots dating back to Houston, 1836. He's married to Sarah Wise, and they have 2 children, Sarah Jane and Jackson. So welcome, Ken. We are thrilled to have you here tonight. I've known Ken
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Absolutely. I've known Ken for a while. He's been a great stakeholder of ours. If I'm not mistaken, one year he wandered up during one of our events honoring Stephen F. Austin, and I made him cut the Austin birthday cake in front of us.
Yeah, that was a highlight.
Yeah, that was a fun time for all. Tonight, we're going to talk about a wide range of topics that he and I thought would just be a lot of fun for us to explore. Some of these are things that he's done some of his own work in. Obviously, there are stories that we get a chance to explore here at the historic site, although we're hoping some of them are obscure enough that there'll be a nice reward for those of you who know the facility and have been out here. If you haven't been here before, we encourage you to consider coming out. We're excited to be one of the state's newest public history facilities. We'll talk more at the end about how you can do that and about what's going on here at our site. So here we are. Those of you watching can see that first banner. So many lawyers. And one of the things I find interesting is that our visitors are surprised that when you think about frontier Texas and people moving as immigrants to Mexican Texas to settle this borderland, I don't think a lot of people imagine there were a bunch of guys in fancy clothes walking around doing lawyerly things. But in fact, there are quite a few lawyers in San Felipe. So Ken, let's kind of run through and talk about some of the people that you know that were prominent lawyers here in San Felipe, and kind of give people an impression about some of their lives. Of course, William Travis is probably the most famous lawyer who lived at San Felipe, and most people understand his impact on early Texas history and the Revolution. But there's some others. Let's talk a little bit about Thomas Jefferson Chambers. I know he's somebody that you've done some research on and has some great.
Yeah, he's great. You know, first I'd say, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm coming from the log cabin inside the museum, which I love. And it's really an honor to be here. You know, I started passing the state park when I was a duck hunter as a teenager and slowly learned about what happened here. And this, to me, is one of the more important places in Texas history. And y'all have done a wonderful job with it. It's one of my favorite places to hang out. And I appreciate you letting me do that tonight. I was thinking about the idea that there were so many lawyers in early Texas. And you know, the way that Texas was colonized was a very legalistic thing. And Spain and then Mexico wanted to give the impression, of course, that they were in control of their immigration and they were in control of the colonization efforts that they were embarking upon. And so they set forth some rules and stuff. And I can only imagine lawyers in the United States going, aha, I can figure that out. And this is a real opportunity for me because I'll understand how to make all these titles work, which was really the crux of all the immigration and all the settlement. The people who came here, the colonists, of course, wanted to prosper and wanted to be free, and that involved land. Texas was all about land, and coming to Texas was all about getting your own piece of land because you probably couldn't do that in the southeastern United States very easily. And so here it was almost free, and it was reportedly extremely fertile, et cetera. And so you had a very high demand. You know, Stephen F. Austin returned from exploring his prospective colony to find hundreds of people wanting to sign up to come. And so you had a lot of demand, and then you had opportunity for lawyers to come in. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying that there were a lot of them here. And of course, William Barrett Travis is probably the most famous. We'll get to him. But Thomas Jefferson Chambers that you mentioned is a very interesting guy because he was a lawyer. He was a law clerk to some judges in Kentucky. And he ended up going to Alabama and getting admitted to the Alabama bar by an Alabama Supreme Court justice who would later be a Texas Supreme Court justice named Abner Lipscomb, who would end up sanctioning Chambers severely for misconduct later on. So that was a little twist. But then Chambers did something strange and he moved to Mexico, the interior of Mexico, to learn Spanish. And during that sojourn, got himself appointed Surveyor General of Texas, which of course was very important because Texas is all about land. And so he got to come up and survey a bunch of these land grants and colonies and such. And he took his salary for all that service in land grants, which he was responsible for surveying. So he would go survey a bunch of choice land and declare it his, whether or not people were already living on it. So he wasn't the most popular lawyer to the extent any of us are popular. But he was kind of a thinker, let's say. And then, of course, spent time in San Felipe in law practice and was involved in the affairs of the town.
I've always been intrigued about his story because so often we think about people coming to Texas specifically for this opportunity. And his entrepreneurial spirit, as you noted, took him to Mexico, where I presume he was going to become a liaison to people in Mexico who were about to be confronting this onslaught of Americans coming into Texas. So he saw the opportunity coming the other direction. And for the most part, that's
absolutely
worked out for him.
And he was the first, if I recall correctly, the first foreigner to hold a Mexican law license. He was a licensed lawyer in Mexico.
Yeah, I believe that's true. It also got him in a little bit of trouble. One of the stories we like to tell is his closeness to the Mexican federal government created a situation here where the revolution government accuses him of perhaps being too loyal or not loyal enough to the revolution. He has a bit of a Tory moment. which next time any of you travel to Austin, if you enter the Capitol building from the south side, there are two cannon that sit there, two howitzer cannon that Thomas Jefferson Chambers procured as a show of his loyalty to Texas independence. They didn't arrive in Texas in time to help Sam out at San Jacinto or anything, but it's interesting to me that they are celebrated there on the grounds of the Capitol. It's a great piece.
Yeah, there was a great feud between Chambers and Burnett, because Burnett sent him to go, or maybe Chambers insisted on going on his own to go raise money and material and all that for the revolutionary cause, and then wasn't there while the revolution was going on. And so there are they used to Twitter of the day were these fake editorials they'd send into the newspapers where they would slam each other, and they're just pages, inches and inches of ink between Burnett and Chambers, and it's a great read.
So he proved his loyalty by missing the war. Yeah, I got
right. Let me say one more thing about Chambers. It's kind of funny. He took all of his salary for serving. He actually served as effectively the first Chief Justice of the Coahuila, Tejas Supreme Court when the Mexican government allowed the states to draft their own constitution in the late 20s. He became effectively the Chief Justice. He wasn't called that, but he also took the salary for that service in land, even though he never actually had to serve he never had to function because, of course, there was a revolution. But he got these land grants, and he started locating all this land, as Surveyor General all over the state, including McClellan County and at present day Travis County. And he claimed the block bordered by 15th, Colorado 12th, and Red River, or whatever the street to the east is, which is, of course, where the Capitol sits now. Yeah. And that's to this day, the longest running real estate litigation in Texas history was the heirs of Thomas Chambers versus the state. And the state ended up settling that case for $25,000. So I don't know how much the Capitol in Austin is worth, but we know it's worth at least $25,000. So
sounds like a pretty good deal, all things considered. One of our other favorite kind of colorful lawyer figures I wanted to give you a chance to maybe comment on is Robert McAlpin Williamson, who lived here for a while. And a lot of his legal acclaim comes during the Republic and later, but he certainly learned the legal skill and was practicing as an attorney while he's here in Mexican Texas. He features in a lot of funny stories. Noah Smithwick, the great storyteller of early Texas, talks about Robert Williamson. Of course, this is the guy history knows as Three-Legged Willie, if that helps any of you at home. Is there any particular story you'd like to share about him or his role as a judge?
Well, he's a favorite of mine. He was really a firebrand, very articulate, must have been a very good lawyer. But he was very much in favor of revolution. Noah Smithwick, a citizen that wrote a lot about the goings on in San Felipe, talks about Williamson being the life of any party, that he'd work in court all day and then party all night, and which I thought was pretty funny, including one time where Smithwick was a blacksmith and Williamson's banging on his door in the middle of the night and had been at a party, and he said something I'm paraphrasing, but Smithwick, outside your door stands a man with a broken leg, and he had broken the wooden leg that he used due to a childhood malady that caused one of his legs to draw up, and his leg had been shattered. So Smithwick gets up, takes him to his shop, and figures out a bracing for it and sets him on his way. But Williamson later became one of the first judges in the Republic, and he was up in East Texas. And one of the best legal history stories from early Texas is he was presiding over court, and there was a case before him, and he had ruled one way, and the man before him wasn't too happy about it. And he pulls out a Bowie knife, sticks it in the bench, and says, "This is the law around Shelby County." And Williamson reaches under the table and pulls out a pistol, cocks it, puts it on the bench, pointed at the offender, and says, "This is the Constitution that overrules your law." So I've always wanted to do that from the bench on the Court of Appeals, but I have yet to find the right opportunity. But
it's a great analogy and a great visual, no matter what. It all plays out well. One of my favorite stories, I think you know a little bit about some of his background too, but Mosley Baker, who is the militia captain here, who has some conflict with Sam Houston during the retreat of the armies and is responsible ultimately for the burning of the town here, overseeing that evacuation and burning of the town. We found an account of him renting a room in Spanish Town, which was the Tejano neighborhood in San Felipe that they referred to by the language that was spoken there. And Baker rents that room ostensibly to get better at his Spanish language skills in preparation for the bar, as you mentioned about Thomas Jefferson Chambers. So he was going to have to take the Mexican bar exam, of course, in Spanish, and he needed to get more proficient at Spanish language. So
well, absolutely, all business was done or supposed to have been done in Spanish. And I'm sure Chambers encouraged him, because if you only have one lawyer that speaks Spanish, that doesn't help. But if you got two, you can fight in court, so they'll both make more money.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, that seal that you can see in the current graphic. That's one that we found doing some of our research, which was for the court system, the municipal court system here at San Felipe. And so a lot of people touched that. Travis, in his role, also served as a secretary to the town government. And so the mayor of town, the alcalde, would sign off on all these various cases. That's part of how they marked those. And Austin himself had ordered the stamps that you see. There was one done for the town council and this one done for the court system. So it was exciting for us to find that in the probate files here in Austin County. It's a great reflection of that part of our history. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that it's a surprisingly litigious society, right? So we attribute that. A lot of what we've learned about the town in our research comes from archival deep dives, and a lot of it comes from probate files. But what we've come to realize is that residents in this town on the frontier, much like the idea that we don't think about having so many lawyers, I didn't necessarily think about these guys suing each other as frequently as they did either. So you and I were talking earlier in preparation for our program, Ken, and I said, this is a chicken and egg thing with me. Did they sue because there are a lot of lawyers looking for work, or were we just litigious people? What do you think was going on the frontier?
Well, I think, both. But I think I've always thought about it as, they were eager to establish an orderly society. And really, the hallmark of that for the United States is the rule of law. And so when they were coming here, they were very eager to get those processes set up so that they could have that orderly, peaceful society. It was in everyone's best interest to have a way to buy and sell all this land that was being bought, at least initially, very inexpensively. Land speculation and the inevitable land fraud was probably the biggest industry in early Texas. And people were joining the Army later on because they could get land. I found a deed in the archives of University of Texas months ago that was a later drafted instrument reflecting a transaction between an Army veteran who immediately sold his 640-acre land certificate and didn't even get the money at the time. They did all the paperwork later. Such was the speed with which the business was getting done. So it was critical for them to have some sort of functioning court system. The other thing that I think happened was, if you think about it, Mexico was very new as a nation, very new when Austin's colony was there. And Mexico, as it existed, had no experience with anything other than a monarchy. And so they were still forming their legal systems and the constitution, just the number of constitutions that they were drafting, it was very much in flux, and the Federalists and the Centralists were fighting, et cetera. So it was really up to Austin's colony to kind of form his own system so that they could do business and have it stick. And I think that is really why they were doing that.
Sure. And it's interesting to us, of course, we talked about what motivation the very inexpensive paying land fees to come and get what amounted to free land in Mexico was to these settlers. But by extension, they weren't particularly financially secure, obviously. And so it's a very debt-driven economy. One of the first things we learned is people are making promises to pay later or to trade. There's a lot of barter and trade going on, but it's all somewhat speculative. I'm going to grow some crops and I'm going to give you some of this, and your family's going to make me some clothes, or I'm going to pay you next month or next year for some service or product. And a lot of these court cases that we find in the municipal court are the ultimate litigation when that deal, the deadline passes and somebody didn't deliver. So right. I always find it funny. It's almost like they go to court. The mayor says, yeah, this guy won. You owe him the money that you still don't have. Good luck with that. I'll turn you back.
Right. What happens. And you go to jail if you can't pay it. So,
yeah, exactly.
And they were trying to, get the markets and just build a society from nothing. It was wilderness. Right. And it's remarkable the things that you have to do.
Well, an important role for us in San Felipe with these lawyers really does come out in that probate process. So we find that's where the rubber meets the road. Somebody dies and the lawyers come in and make a list of what they owed and who owed them and tries to make a balance sheet out of that. And for us, putting together a story at a place like San Felipe, that offers great insights into material culture. What kind of things did people own? What kind of things did people place value on? So that's been really, really helpful to us, those legal files related to the probate process.
Well, it's funny. I've been involved in court record preservation for many, many years. And we started with the Harris County court records because those are some of the earliest in the state. And we've extended it statewide. You mentioned it when you were introducing me. And that is the last frontier of original primary source research. There's fascinating things in court files. And like you say, especially probate, because you can speculate all day long about who owned what and who lived where, but you can go into their probate file and it'll probably be there. And court records tell you a lot about a society.
They absolutely do. So to that end, I want to pivot to a really important part of society. As a state historic agency, the Texas Historical Commission, and through our site, we have an obligation to kind of help fill in gaps that history has omitted or lost in the past. And so an important story for us, obviously related to the institution of slavery, related to how those legal complications played out in Austin's colony in Mexico and into the Republic. And we're really honored to have some truly remarkable stories of free people of color, African Americans who might have come to Texas enslaved. You and I were talking about how there's this unusual trend that I'm not sure any of us have totally figured out yet, of people being emancipated, of free Blacks that are part of this story as well. That's by no means the norm. We don't want to downplay the realities of the institution of human bondage and all of its horrors, but it's a really unique component to this society and how it was working. So why don't you take a second and just kind of explain to us some of what you believe is going on?
Well, what's interesting, and I always tell this to groups when it's relevant to what I'm talking about, is one of the reasons I love Texas so much and have dedicated my entire career to serving her is that Texas is different than the rest of the country. It really is, in almost every respect. And I think, of course, I'm going to say better. But the history of Texas is so unique, which makes our present so unique and so critical to preserve that. And one of the areas is when you're talking about the issue of slavery, which of course was a horrible stain on the United States. But in Texas, it looked a little different. There were a remarkable number of free people of color in early Texas, pre-revolution Texas. They owned property. They were members of society, citizens of society. There were a lot of them. And now they were not treated as equals because that was the time. But there are some remarkable stories, including the Celia Allen story, of course, is so critical to San Felipe because she lived here and worked here and prospered here, raised her children here. And she was the subject of a big lawsuit. A guy named John Allen claimed to own her and her children and went before the town council and freed her or purported to. And then his business partner, a guy named Laughlin McLaughlin, not making that up, yep. Filed a claim saying, wait a minute, Allen had borrowed some money, if my memory serves, with Celia perhaps as the security for the note, or that he was owed a debt and Celia was part of his property and he was going to claim Celia and her children. And Celia ended up in court fighting for her freedom. And was awarded her freedom.
That probate story we were talking about, in her case, that's part of her story too. The business partners, Mr. Allen and Mr. McLaughlin, who were squabbling over whether to free Celia or allow her to have her manumission. Mr. McLaughlin dies unexpectedly in the middle of this discussion. So it's actually his attorneys and his probate attorneys who are representing him saying, you owe money, you can't free this woman if you owed our estate money. And you're right, she gets kind of swept up into it. And ironically, several of the people we've already talked about tonight end up touching this case. Thomas Jefferson Chambers has a role in some of the manumission documents, and William Travis at one point is hired to defend her free status. So it's an interesting story, really fascinating one for us, and we're thrilled to be able to tell it.
Yeah, Travis, and that's, I believe, I'm looking at the graphic that I believe our listeners can see. That's two of her sons in the lower left of that picture, which are part of that great Faces of San Felipe exhibit y'all still have here.
Yeah, which
But
is behind me. So Ken's in the cabin tonight. I'm in the temporary gallery, and the exhibit that he just alluded to is here behind me. I will warn those of you that are watching at home, this exhibit will close soon. So get out here quickly if you want to see the faces.
It's a fascinating exhibit. And she, she was a pretty prominent citizen. She did a lot of cooking and washing for the community and ran the bake oven, if I recall.
Right.
And, so it's no surprise that the citizens of the town would be on her side. And I think that just shows you, I don't think people, especially these days, when you talk about race relations before the Civil War, people tend to see it, one way or the other, and they don't realize there was a lot of nuance. There was a great case, I don't want to get off too much away from San Felipe, but there was a great case in the Harris County District Courts where a woman named Emmeline and her children had been freed, and then an unscrupulous slave catcher tried to re-enslave her and sell her, and she filed a lawsuit in the district court before a slave-owning judge with slave-owning jurors represented by the most prominent lawyer in Houston at the time. And the jury found in her favor that she was free. In fact, on this graphic, there's a court document in the lower center where she signed I think that's an injunction bond with an X, just like Celia would have signed her papers with her X, because they couldn't write English. And it's a remarkable document. And so there are many other stories like that. And it's a shame that they faced the kind of oppression that they did, but they were also very brave, and the court system functioned and often did the right thing.
Sure, and you mentioned it, there's a great deal of nuance to this, and I think anytime you start dealing with human relation, that becomes a big part of this. So I want to close, I thought about introducing this topic this way, but I want to close with it on two fronts. We deal with a lot of visitors who are exploring DNA and genealogy, right? That's a big part of our culture now, and how you learn more about yourself by participating with Ancestry or 23andMe or whatever. And I'm intrigued about the number of African-American visitors who are finding sites like ours out of an interest in discovering where that sort of biracial moment, typically related to the institution of slavery, happened. And they come to us with those sorts of exploratory questions like anyone would. And it's a great way for us to start embarking on a history, helping people whose paper history may be compromised or lost, but who can make other connections to figure out the past.
Well, and that takes me back to the court records, because the only place you're going to find written genealogy of the slaves often is the court records, the probate records you referenced.
Right. I also wanted to mention, we sometimes get people who talk about the racial components of immigrating to Mexican Texas, and that there are black and white issues, there are brown and white issues, there are a lot of different things that people want to compartmentalize this story into. And I find it a really powerful way to help people process, as you've noted, kind of the nuance of having to be part of a multicultural society as an immigrant. That nuance goes away during the Republic, right? In many ways, it's much harsher on some of these race issues, at least in the way that it's presented legally. So in the Republic of Texas, the Constitution effectively makes an effort to dismiss the legal status of being free and black, right? It's a different sort of world once independence is gained. Any comments you have about research you've done or things you know about that?
Well, I think, I've got a comment about it. When they came here, and they all had, meaning people of different races and backgrounds, had to live together and survive.
Exactly.
and grow their own food and raise their own food, and they were all in it together, and they had to be together to survive. They couldn't separate on things as superficial as race. They had to be together. And that's when I mentioned that Celia Allen is a prominent citizen of San Felipe, much more prominent than many of her fellow white citizens, because she's productive and important and playing an important role in the community. And you see a lot of that. And then you introduce politics, and you introduce the politics of slavery and coming from the United States and the desire for statehood, and you introduce that, and the people start to separate a little bit, and you see the worst coming out and being enshrined in these legal documents. And then this is going to sound a little strange, But when you're faced with adversity, and my favorite example is Hurricane Harvey, what happened? Well, everybody came out because you had to, and you work together and you drop the pretense and you take your mask off, and you know what? We're all in this together, and we're all citizens of the same community. And so we can do it, and it shouldn't have to be adversity that gets us there. So that's what I love about early Texas is people were focused on the right things, and they didn't let somebody's color get in the way. And then of course that's not to ignore the great sin of slavery, but we can overcome it.
Absolutely. That's a great response. I appreciate that. I want to transition into our next topic real quickly. And one of the things that, some of these are quirky. I think we're going to talk about a couple of quirky tonight, but, crime and punishment is a significant part of legal history in any community. And on the frontier, it can often take the form of sometimes vigilante justice, or even in your wonderful story about Judge Williamson, having kind of a cheeky moment where he's showing who's in charge with a litigant before him. But I've always been fascinated by some of these cases. And of course, there's not the formality of law enforcement the way we think about it today, that the criminal process is very different. I had a chance to share with you, we have in our exhibit a little story of a tar and feather incident. And I'm curious as to your take on that. It had to do with a gentleman who comes to town, kind of a crank, complaining about the, I'm enjoying that long-haired.
I'm not sure what that was.
I think he's going to jail. This guy comes to town complaining about the legal fees, or the fees for processing land, essentially, and he threatens to burn down Austin's land office. And that motivates some local men to teach him a lesson. So what do you think about the prevalence of this kind of frontier justice, or are you surprised by it? What's your take on some of this stuff?
Well, I, as a state official and a judge on the Court of Appeals, I have to expressly disapprove of people operating outside the law. But I can say, as a historian, I can certainly understand how the citizens would not, times were pretty harsh back then. The environment was harsh, and people were fighting for everything they got, including their food. And so they were not going to tolerate people going outside the social compact and jeopardizing the entire community. And I think that tar and feather incident that you mentioned is a great example of that. There's no need for the court system there. That guy was going to burn down, their land titles and their land grants and the building where all of that happened, and they weren't going to have it. And it's curious, when you think about the early United States settlements and kind of the Puritan communities, and the idea that someone would be banished from the community and not entitled to live there anymore. They did that a lot in San Felipe.
Right.
And, they tar and feather him and send him on his way, never to return, because they're just, not going to tolerate. They can't afford to tolerate that kind of stuff, not even the threat.
Yeah, I had found in an early newspaper account here that I think was probably written and or edited by Robert Williamson. He spent some time with the first newspaper in the colony, where he talks about a shoplifter in the business district being tied to a dead tree stump in what would have been Commerce Square, right here close to where the historic site is centered. And this guy getting 39 lashes for shoplifting in one of the local stores, picking up a shirt or something, and kind of ended on this cheeky note that few people would go in and think they're going to attire themselves that way in the future once they see this guy get whipped.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Crazy stuff. I wanted to say there was another discussion that you and I had about some other topics. Is there any other kind of vigilante or frontier justice you wanted to comment on?
Well, they had, there was a man named Baptiste who was also a shoplifter. I think it was a different case, because they gave him 100 lashes. So he must have been a big guy, but because 40 was supposed to have killed you. But yeah, they didn't tolerate that at all. The first trial in Houston was, and this area, when the Republic began, this area would have been part of that district. And the first trial that was ever held in March of 1837, somebody had stolen a pig. Well, if you steal a pig from somebody, that's their livelihood, perhaps, or that's how their family's going to eat for months. And he too was given 39 lashes and branded on the hand with a T. And the other interesting thing about that is the sentence was to be, the sentencing document was signed, the judgment was signed, let's say on a Tuesday, the sentence to be carried out on Friday. So there was no need for someone at the appellate level in those days. You suffered your punishment immediately.
Justice was.
And so
one other story that I think is a fun one related to this, and it's very directly site related because it's part of the motivation, I think, for his eventual memoirs. But Noah Smithwick ends up being banished from Austin.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Ostensibly for aiding and abetting a presumed murder suspect who had potentially killed, I believe, the alcalde or an official in Gonzales. What do you know about that story that you'd like to share?
Well, I believe that story is Smithwick, of course, was a blacksmith, and he rigged it so when they got him to chain the guy up, he gave the guy the ability to escape, and the guy did escape, and so they considered Smithwick a quote unquote bad citizen and banished him from San Felipe. And he was happy to go, allegedly, but I don't know how happy he really was. But he had to leave in a hurry.
Yeah,
that's Smithwick on this graphic there in the bottom.
Yeah, that is Noah Smithwick right there. And if you're not familiar with his memoirs, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a retail package we have here tonight. And I should mention, we're privileged in our collection. We don't have it on display all the time, but James Bevel gave us a wonderful document that he had owned. It was a letter from Smithwick, essentially announcing kind of a power of attorney as he's leaving Austin's colony. So he's telling people he's leaving, but this is the guy that's going to represent him in business matters. He happened to be a blacksmith named Jabez Barney. And you can see and hear and read in the letter some of his indignation. You know, I'm leaving, but this guy's my rep, and if you need me, this is how to do business with Smithwick once I'm gone. So, an interesting part of his legal chapter.
Yeah, Smithwick was none too happy with that situation, but
yeah, but it made for a colorful memoir, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the best early books on Texas history around.
Well, and I've always appreciated his Monday morning quarterbacking, hoping that fire and brimstone comes down on San Felipe as he's leaving, right? Knowing full well 60 years later that the town will be destroyed by fire. So well played, Noah, well played. For our last topic tonight, before we get into some Q&A and let some of our viewers share some of their thoughts with you, I've always been intrigued about how the Catholic Church integrates into immigrants' lives in the colonial parts of Texas here. And, you know, specifically, Austin's colony, and Austin motivates this through some of his supporters, they begin a process of civil marriages, which is not, I don't think in any way an effort to bypass the Catholic Church. It's to deal with the reality that the church doesn't have a constant presence on the frontier. So Austin's got a farmer who needs a son-in-law to help him get some crops out of the field, right? This guy's trying to marry off his daughter and trying to make his life better, and he needs a way to do that. So Austin embarks on this plan of essentially civil marriage, courthouse marriage, with the expectation then that those citizens are going to catch up with the Catholic Church. What do you know about some of these early marriages?
Well, yeah, one of the rules that you had to follow when you came to Austin's colony and immigrated to Mexico was you had to become Catholic, and if your marriage was not performed by a priest, it was not a valid marriage. You know, you got to remember that the church had a lot of power in Mexico, and it was a quasi-governmental entity, you know, and so if the ceremony was not performed by a priest, then you weren't married in the eyes of the law. And that was especially true in Austin's colony because Mexico knew these people coming across were going to be largely Protestant. And so they assigned a priest to Texas, just one, named Michael Muldoon. And Muldoon's reputation was somewhat questionable. I know Smithwick talked about him coming around only when he needed money. So he'd come solemnize all the marriages at $25 a pop, which was an astronomical sum back then. And when he needed money, and then he'd be gone again. But he also commented that he liked to drink a lot. In fact, there's a funny story Smithwick tells that Father Muldoon and some other prominent citizen were walking around imbibing and walked into a saloon, and a guy named Adam said, "Well, here, Padre, sit down and have a drink with me." And Muldoon got a little proud of saying he only drank with gentlemen. So Adams punched him in the face, at which point he reportedly decided Adams was a gentleman and sat down and drank with him. But Muldoon had somewhat questionable reputation, at least from the colonist standpoint. Now, you got to take that with a grain of salt because it's Smithwick, and they were not fans of the Catholic Church. It was very foreign to the immigrants, this idea that the church would have so much power, and they really resented it. And in fact, there's some vicious anti-Catholic writing from some of the early Texas colonists. But Muldoon would come around and he would make official all those marriage contracts that had been signed. If you think about it, it's really, I suppose, kind of an advantage. They'd execute a marriage bond, and then I guess if it didn't work out, they could just in the middle of the night rip it up and go their separate ways. Everything would be fine. But some of those bonds were pretty high, as I recall.
Yeah, we were talking about one that I've had a lot of exposure to through descendants of the old 300, Austin's first contract families. And two of the first families, Sylvanus Castleman and I believe John Crownover, they had children who married, which was common. You move to the frontier, you're the first families there. Inevitably, a lot of the old 300s children intermarry. So that becomes part of that genealogical story. But in the case of Castleman's daughter, I believe her name was Nancy, who married John C. Crownover, I want to say the pledge we found suggested that they were going to bond at $20,000, which is just a ridiculous sum for that time.
Yeah.
Not money that anyone could get their hands on, which is sort of this Romeo and Juliet processing of the romance of marriage, right? So they're basically saying, we are so committed. We know we're going to, when the church is here, we're going to pledge an astronomical sum of money as a fee if we don't come. We know this is
20,000 definitely signifies true love.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't know what a lesser amount might signify, but
the Texas frontier, at least. And then I think we shared with you another one of our favorite stories here involves a settler named Joseph Polly. And in doing some work with them and their research and their family, it appears that within the Polly lineage, they had a civil marriage because that was the convenient marriage when they were waiting for the church. They then had the Catholic marriage. And then ultimately, when they were able to, within the independence of the Republic, they have a Protestant marriage, which more matches their past experience. So they end up married 3 times, and three different entities they got to stand before or to process with. So those are all really.
I'm sorry. That reminds me. It sort of brings us back to where we started with all the lawyers. I mean, there's always some kind of legalistic aspect to all of the regular lives of these colonists. Even going back to Celia Allen, there was an attempt by slave owners who were immigrating to get around the Mexican anti-slavery laws by entering into these long indenture contracts, much like the marriage bond for $20,000. They'd have an indenture contract for 99 years or something crazy, all in an attempt to lawyer their way around and set up the society they were used to.
Sure. Yeah, to your point about Muldoon too, I meant to mention, you kind of processed it this way. Our understanding is by the time he would get here, oftentimes he might be marrying 20 or 30 or even more couples who had those civil ceremonies. And in fact, in some instances, depending on how long he'd been away, he might be baptizing bride, groom, and firstborn in the course of marriage coming together as things played out. I know you did some very specific research about one of our favorite residents that extends a little beyond our San Felipe story, but we find this one a fascinating one. Angelina Payton, who Austinites, people who live in Austin know as Angelina Eberly. Very few of our visitors necessarily know either one of her stories, but if they know one, they almost never know the other. If they know her as Angelina Eberly, they don't know anything about her time in Austin's colony. If they know her as Angelina Payton, they often don't make the connection to what happened in Austin. But you did some research into her second marriage where she became Mrs. Eberly, right?
Right. I actually, I wrote an article this summer about the first court of the Republic, which was a court created by executive order because we had captured a Mexican ship right before San Jacinto. And what I discovered was that the judge of that court, Benjamin C. Franklin, who was appointed ostensibly to try the admiralty case around that Mexican ship, actually kept the court open. And it goes back to a comment I made earlier that the colonists were so eager to have a functioning legal system so they could do their business. And so Franklin just kept this court open, and no one's ever really talked about that before. And I found a record of what he did in that court in his personal papers. That's Judge Franklin's personal papers. And one of the entries in that record was Angelina Payton's marriage to Jacob Eberly. and it was performed by Judge Franklin in the courthouse, wherever that in Brazoria, supposedly. And that's where she became Angelina Eberly. And of course, as you mentioned, she was Angelina Payton when she lived here in San Felipe, running Payton's Tavern, and one of the last people out of the town before Mosley Baker put it to the torch. So she was a prominent citizen everywhere she lived. And I discovered her marriage record. Fascinating Texas woman.
I seem to recall, it seemed like a pretty stout fee for her second marriage as well. Is that true? Do you remember what the fee was?
I want to say it was $50, but once the archives open, I'll do more work on it. But I took a picture of one page of that book, thinking I was going to come right back there the following week. Well, unfortunately, that was the last week of February when I did that, and
there you go.
They haven't opened the archives back up at the University of Texas, so I can't find that.
Understood. Yeah, so Angelina Payton outlived her first husband here. He dies before independence.
Right.
He ends up marrying Mr. Eberly. And of course, there's stories of her running a boarding house and tavern in Austin as the capital eventually, that supposedly Sam Houston preferred to the presidential manse. That's one of the stories that gets told about.
Yeah, he stayed at Eberly House.
Yeah, exactly. Well, those are really great stories for us to help kind of process how life on the frontier worked and how legalese played into it. I'm going to transition into a few of the questions that have been thrown up at us. I think I may be able to help with a couple of them, although I'm sure you can comment on all of them. I want to try to prioritize a few of the big picture ones first. So we had a participant ask tonight, is it true that when Austin was arrested in Mexico City, that he never had a trial? Was he charged with a crime? What was the outcome there? I don't know how much you know about that, but you have any thoughts?
I don't think he ever did have a trial. I think he was just eventually released.
Correct, yeah.
We sent somebody down there to try to negotiate with Santa Ana, and eventually they just let him out. But he wasn't ever, I suppose the charge would be sedition, but I think it was more just political anger and confusion about what to do about these colonists.
I think the holding charge, you're exactly right, was something along the lines of sedition. And I think later on, we're going to have a question about one of the attorneys who was involved in trying to represent Austin in a more broad sense. But there were attorneys that went down to try to assist him in prepping for a case, but no charges really formally ever came. And in fact, part of the comedy of errors of his experience in Mexico City, he's initially in a dungeon, eventually ends up under house arrest, just kind of find a place to stay and don't leave town. And then eventually just drop it all together and let him leave and come back to Texas. And of course, when he arrives here, he's not yet committed to the cause of independence, but he is committed to the idea that diplomacy has failed.
Right.
No longer a pen answer. This is now a sword.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about, someone asked, was there a seminal moment in the establishment of the rule of law, some kind of a milestone for Texas, or did it just evolve over time? Is it still evolving? How does that work?
Wow, that's a good question. I think I would say no, there's not a seminal moment necessarily, but I think there was just so much confusion in Mexico and the laws changed so frequently. Now, remember, it wasn't like you could just post something on Facebook and everybody would know that it happened. It would take weeks and months for information to travel around. And Mexico really hadn't sorted out how it was going to structure its government. And so, yeah, there were laws, but you didn't know what they were. You didn't know what they were going to be a month from now. You may not hear about them until 3 or 4 months after they're passed, and you've been violating them the whole time and had no idea. It was just a very confusing situation. And one of the things that caused Austin so much stress, if you read his writings, is that very thing. And he finally was able to make his own law for his colony to a certain extent, where he could get a little bit of certainty in what was happening. Because there was no body of common law to look to like there was in the United States. And so I think, but I will say, one of the very important moments was that captured Mexican ship I mentioned, because we captured the ship on April the 3rd. We win the Battle of San Jacinto on April the 21st, and interests in the United States are screaming for these rebellious outlaw Texans to give the ship back. Unfortunately, we had taken the cargo off the ship and used it at the Battle of San Jacinto. That was an important moment, causing the creation of that court. But that didn't create law. We didn't have law until later in 1836. So I think the answer is there's not one moment, but everybody was desperate all the time to have a functioning legal system.
Yeah, and I think as you noted, in a place like immigrant Texas, in Mexican Texas, inevitably people are trying to kind of fight through and create these pockets of normalcy. And so I think it happens in isolated senses. It happens almost organically in some instances. It is somewhat evolutionary. And in some ways it's reactive because the laws can't be consistently enforced. Mexico doesn't have
Right.
the resources here. That's a really complicated story. You're right, that was a great question. Um, Someone has asked about Juan Almonte journaling that he's corresponding with people in New York during the military campaign and during the Texas campaign. He also asked, was there any indication that Thomas Jefferson Chambers might have been corresponding with sources in New York or maybe otherwise who were land speculating? I don't know enough about Chambers that I can comment on that. Do you have any thoughts?
I don't really know that part of Chambers I'm familiar with what Chambers was doing for himself, but and he did sell some of that land. Now, Chambers did go to the United States in the early 1840s to try to sell some of the land that he had claimed. And the claim was legitimate, except for the fact that a lot of people were living on the land that he later claimed. But he was entitled to the acreage, at least. So I don't know if that's what the questioner is asking about. There was a biography of Chambers done many, many years ago. He probably needs a new one. And then Almonte's Texas is a great resource for Almonte's discussions. But we Texians wanted statehood immediately. So there were very close ties maintained with the United States throughout the process.
If that viewer wants to clarify anything in that question, if we missed on that, feel free to submit another comment and we'll try to tag back into that. When Texas achieved its independence, this is one I can help out a little bit on, although I'm sure you have some thoughts too. When Texas achieved its independence, many colonists were likely in the process of perfecting or finalizing title to their land grants under Mexican law. What happened to the colonization law? Did the new republic keep it in effect? How were those grants processed or honored? What do you know about that?
Well, there was a commission formed to confirm the land grants. And you know who was on the commission? A guy named Chambers, whose nephew was Thomas Jefferson Chambers.
Gotcha.
And so the Chambers strikes again with his uncle was on that commission. So there was a commission to confirm those Mexican land grants.
Well, we have a great partnership with the General Land Office, and we often tell people when they talk about seeing things in our collection that we utilize from them, in our exhibit, that we utilize from their collection, I often point out Texas is using land as a commodity just like Spain and Mexico had attempted to before. So it was deeply important to know or to try to understand who owned what, right? So all of those early land grants get translated to English so that the new government can process who owns what and where things are. I would say to you, questioner, we have a very interesting story specifically in our exhibit. In fact, in the cabin that Ken is sitting in tonight, the German settler, Peter Piper was his name, that we believe may have built that cabin that we interpret. He's one of Austin's last contract grantees. He gets here in about 1834. And he is in exactly the situation that was asked in the question. He's worked on his survey. He's filed the paperwork trying to get his deed title from the Mexican government. And a number of things start to happen. These allegations of speculation through the state government of Coahuila and Texas start to play out. Because of the war, both the Mexican government and the colonial efforts here in Texas, both sides are threatening to shut down the land offices and end that potential speculation. And so in his case, Mr. Piper doesn't get his deed before independence, but he goes to the newly formed General Land Commission after independence in the Republic, shows them all his paperwork, and lo and behold, one of our more prominent residents, John Borden, who was a surveyor, had become the first land commissioner. He basically says, I know this guy, we did his survey, rubber stamps it and puts it through. So he started the application as a Mexican citizen and got his land from the Republic of Texas. So I'm sure that's a particularly unique case, but to your point, Ken, that's a real challenge. The Republic had to immediately kind of figure out who owned what. And even at the beginning of our discussion tonight, people are being paid in land spec for military service and those sorts of things. And men who came to Texas and died, their families would come and pursue some of those land claims.
Oh, that was huge business. Yeah. Huge. And an interesting tag to that is the length of measurement known as the vara the Spanish length of measurement is still our official length of measurement in Texas for the surveyors, if I'm
Right.
correct on that.
If you don't know what a vara is, we'll tell you that in the exhibit too. So come on in and see us. In fact, in these wonderful times, one of my staff, our collections manager, helped us put a sign together for our visitors during the pandemic that says you need to stay a vara apart in your social distance, 2 vara apart, which would get you to about 6 feet. A couple of other questions we want to run through. I think one of them may be over my head. I hope you know what this means. It sounds like there's an insider component to it that I'm not understanding. But we had a participant tonight ask, what is the toughest bar in Texas? And one of my colleagues thinks they know the answer. I still don't get it. I see what she's suggesting. It almost sounds like, you know, is it the bar at the Minger Hotel? Is this a lawyer question?
The toughest bar?
The toughest bar in Texas. Is this something that you've ever heard or know? And there's just one.
I'm not sure.
Okay, so what we think the answer is that it's the Alamo. It's the 6 men who were lawyers who died at the Alamo. Like
yes. I'm guessing now who asked that question.
Would you know?
You will.
Go ahead.
You will find a great article about lawyers who fought at the Alamo, written by my friend Dylan Drummond.
Okay.
If you.
I know Dylan. That's not the asker of the question, interestingly enough, but that lets me, you know, I'll play a little insider baseball for you if I've never told this story. When we were still working on the museum, we hadn't started construction yet. The first time I ever talked to Dylan, he called me and said he was working on that article to write about
yes.
the Alamo. And my favorite part of the story was I was sitting in our old historic building across the street, and he said, I'm on a deadline. I'm gonna get in the car and drive over there Friday and take a picture of the building to recruit troops. And I think I told him something to the effect, if you can do that, I'm putting you on the exhibit team, because we don't even know where that building was. So good luck. But yeah, Dylan's a great lover of Texas history and obviously a pretty stout lawyer as well. So good stuff. Did we just get some clarification on that one? Sorry. So this says the Alamo Bar Association is the answer. This is some kind of
yes, that is the answer
that I failed. Apologies. I'm not an attorney. And
well, they should have put association in the original question. We might have gotten it.
All right. If it said the toughest bar association, I got you. We have a Peter Grayson fan in the crowd tonight. And I don't know if, do you know anything specifically about Peter Grayson?
Very prominent lawyer in Houston, and I don't know if he lived in San Felipe or not. I think he got here.
He did spend some time in San Felipe, and he's also one of the attorneys who was working on the Austin case in Mexico City. But this question specifically has to do, apparently he was involved in some kind of a long-held litigation over his land grants, or I'm sure he wasn't alive for that, because he's one of the candidates for the Second Republic presidency who ends up dead, if you remember that story.
Right.
But this writer says that the litigation over his land grants lasted from 1838 to 1899, so about 60 years. And I think the question is, you made that allusion to the conflict over the Capitol lands and Thomas Jefferson Chambers. He's asking if that conflict exceeded that 60-year mark he gave for the Grayson land. And
well, I don't know that I think the Chambers litigation over the Capitol Hill was one case.
Okay.
And so we'll have to, some enterprising author should do an article about that, I guess.
This writer, this questioner may be the person who's working on that as we speak. So, and of course, Grayson also served as the first Attorney General under Sam Houston, but he was of the 2 candidates who ended up deceased that were potentially going to succeed Houston as sort of the Houston carrier, or the ongoing voice of Houston's platform as president. Grayson's the one that committed suicide. The other one, I believe Collinsworth, is the one that may or may not have committed suicide, but ended up at a drunken boat party in the Gulf and fell off and drowned.
Right.
Confused about his story. I don't think I have any more questions tonight. So is there anything else that you would like to end on before we wrap this up and put our legal and Texas history interests to bed for the night?
Well, I'd just like to thank you again for letting me participate. I love San Felipe de Austin. It's such a wonderful place, and I love to just spend as much time here as I can, especially with all the new buildings, a replica of the town going up next door. I can't wait for it to open.
Yeah, we were thrilled to give you a little bit of a preview today. And any of you that are coming out soon, you'll see from our parking lot what's going on out there with this outdoor exhibit that we're hoping to open next year. I did have one more question come in, Ken, that's from a longtime stakeholder who asked about San Felipe hosting the consultation and the early revolution government. And he asks why the government moves to Washington to declare independence. I certainly have some takes on that with my colleagues at Washington, but do you have any thoughts on the moving of the revolution government?
There's a reason they were up there. Actually, I forgot. If I knew, I forgot. I don't know. But wasn't there a specific reason that they were in Washington for that? They decided to meet there, not here.
You know, there was an active part of the General Council at the directive of Henry Smith as the governor of the provisional Mexican state of Texas. He tasks a committee with choosing the next location for the revolution government. And there's all kinds of little pockets of intrigue and things that play out. But I always tell visitors who ask that question, you know, yes, San Felipe is the host to the first 3 of 4 delegate meetings where immigrant Texans get together to be frustrated about the politics of Mexico. So we have the first 3. We then begin the government that runs the revolution after the consultation, and then the government moves to Washington to declare independence. I do feel like when you look at the makeup of the delegation at Washington, I think people that were really involved in it felt that that declaration needed to happen somewhere else. I think there was a geography to this story, and San Felipe had become the place where, whether through Austin's influence or just broader political thoughts, this was the place where people tried to make appeasement and diplomacy and being good Mexican citizens work. And I think for a lot of the newer Texans, they wanted a clean slate. Some of these newcomers who were actively involved in the move to independence wanted to do that somewhere else. I think that truly is part of its story.
Well, I think you're probably onto something there. I would have given a much more pedestrian thought of it's Washington was off the main road.
Well, they may have been a need to buy groceries in Nacogdoches and they stopped along the way. I don't know if there's a simple answer like that.
But you know, there was a lot of conflict. I mean, there were a whole group of settlers on the eastern part of Texas that didn't want independence, and they looked upon the quote unquote boys on the Brazos as not looking out for the best interests of everybody. But
well, and I would even say a lot of the boys on the Brazos, there's confusion about that. So when I deal with old 300 descendants, for instance, many of them are wonderfully proud, as they should be, of their ancestry, but I think they misunderstand sometimes. A lot of the old settlers, they weren't in favor of doing rash things. They were very conservative about this. They'd made a 10-year investment in a new nation. What they basically wanted was a government that wasn't going to hurt or abuse them. And so they weren't chomping at the bit to declare independence and go to war and risk everything if there was a better answer. And so I think you're right. There was a lot of confusion about how it plays out. One of my staff has suggested there was a free rent component at Washington being offered. I tell this funny story that one of our researchers helped me with. There are letters, you know, some of the delegates who came here in 32 and 33 were the same people. They came for both trips. And so there are these wonderful, colorful letters that people write back to their families and things to say, oh, San Felipe is a dump. There's not a decent hotel. You can't get a meal. You can't get anything. Well, of course, when they moved to Washington as a new town, many of them write the same letters. Oh, Washington is a dump. So I don't know how much of that factored in. I know we found some suggestions in some of the committee meeting minutes. Our researcher, a great researcher, Michael Moore, working with us, found a suggestion that one of the more prominent members of the consultation, you know, when the 1835 consultation is going on, it's this wonderfully rare moment where the diplomats have to decide to be soldiers or statesmen. So Stephen F. Austin's in the field. He's leading an army. Most of our visitors don't grasp that there's this moment where he chooses the sword instead of the pen. And Travis is with him. Travis was elected to the consultation and didn't go. But the committee looking at options for where to go included a man named Wiley Martin, who supported San Felipe as the ongoing seat of government. And he has this crisis of conscience where he's on the committee and then he kind of says, hey boys, I've got to go join the battle. I can't do this statesmanship thing too long. There's people dying out there. And as he leaves, the committee votes to move, right? Okay, he's gone. I don't know how much of that intrigue really played out, but I do believe, and I think our visitors can process this well. San Felipe has a very specific story. We've occasionally had people come in and get offended that there's a lot of Mexican symbolism in our story. Well, as I tell them, the town was 13 years of history, and 98% of it was Mexican Texas. It's only around for a month after independence. So we are a Mexican Texas story. And I think that may be part of what triggers this need to be somewhere new, to be a new place and think about what Texas is going to become. And of course,
No, and
Washington.
it was a critically important place because it was the center of Mexico was finally going to solve the problem that had plagued Spain and Mexico for 200 years, and that's colonizing Texas. So it was critical for the Mexican government too.
Well, Ken, if you bear with me for a couple of minutes, we're going to run through our closing show here. For those of you that are still with us, we often attach a little retail opportunity where we give a discount to people that have bothered to spend some time with us tonight. We know your time is valuable, even during this crazy pandemic when you're trapped at home. So for tonight, as you can see in that slide, we're doing a little bundle that includes that Noah Smithwick memoir that we've alluded to several times tonight. It's still in print through the University of Texas, so we proudly stock it in our gift shop. And so we are selling a replica reproduction piece of 8, an 8 real coin, along with the Noah Smithwick book, Evolution of a State. And you're going to see some contact information for us shortly. If you're interested in that deal, you can drop an email to me, or you can call us. We're open tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, whenever it's convenient to ask for that deal. The Raconteur treasure. So obviously Smithwick is our Raconteur, our colorful storyteller. All right. I really want to mention again, if you're not someone who's followed Judge Wise's podcast, it's a really fabulous piece. We've been privileged to be featured on Wise About Texas. You know, disclosure there. We're not just scratching backs here. Ken's a great guest for us. We hope you enjoyed having him for our program tonight. But we've certainly been honored to be featured on his podcast as well. And if you're not familiar with Wise About Texas, I encourage you to jot down or get you a screen capture of that slide so that you can visit the website and see what's going on. We asked if we could promote his upcoming piece, and he had to admit to us tonight he's scrambling a little bit. So we don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be great.
I had a little election to deal with recently, but came out on the good side, and I'm ready to get back to podcasting.
He's been busy in the last few weeks, but he assured us this weekend he's probably going to land whatever that next great topic is going to be.
I will be working on it all week.
Keep an eye on his website. I'll also mention, if you enjoy this kind of stuff, both Ken and I happen to be featured in a new series that the General Land Office has done recently in separate episodes, and those are both up. So I think we're going to post on our Facebook page here in the next day or so links to those programs if you'd like to see those, if you enjoy this kind of history navel gazing from your house on your computer. All right, so thank you for that. Oops, we jumped past next month's program. So as you can see there, if you want to join us for our December, our closing calendar year, we treat our History at Night season as kind of a school year season. So it straddles the calendar year. Season 2 will go into the spring. But our last program for this calendar year for 2020 is going to be with the former curator of the Alamo, Dr. Bruce Winders, a great friend of ours, a great lover of Texas history, wonderfully knowledgeable. And as you can see there, he's going to do a program for us about William Travis, citizen of Texas. And I think what you're going to hear from Bruce is an effort to sort of nuance the Travis reputation away from young hothead who gets himself killed at the Alamo to something a little more substantive. So I hope you're able to join us for that. We presume that program will also be virtual. So you can see the registration information there below. You can also find those links on our Facebook page. So feel free to join us. That's the week before Christmas. I have it on good authority. We're going to have a really cool retail package for that night too. If you're looking for a late stocking stuffer, come see us in December. It'll be a lot of fun. Lastly, here's just a quick overview on our production team. I've got one of the best staffs in the Texas history business. And I think most of our guests who've had a chance to participate in this have appreciated having a chance to work with them. That includes some of our Austin staff, as you see there, who help us with some of our digital media. We're all learning how to work in this crazy world, and thrilled that I can do a program tonight without a mask on. We often are doing that as we interact with folks. And I guess I'll let you know, if you are planning to visit soon, we are still somewhat impacted by the pandemic, obviously. So our hours of operation have changed. We are closed on Mondays and Tuesdays so that we can better serve you and keep the site cleaned and disinfected and be here present for you for the other 5 days of the week. So come see us Wednesday through Sunday. For a while, we were only offering structured tours, but we have now transitioned into a world where you can interact with our multimedia again, but we're going to issue you some PPE. We'll give you some gloves and things. We have styluses and things you can use to interact with those features without being particularly worried about touch. We are still requiring masks inside buildings, so be prepared for that when you come out. If you happen to be in town and show up without a mask, we can issue you a paper mask that you can use for your visit. So here's the contact information that's useful to all of you playing at home. You see my email address there. I am the site manager here at San Felipe de Austin. And if you want to send me your request about retail, you can do so at that web address or at that email address. You can also use the generic, there's a generic address on our website, which you see below, www.visitsanfelipedeaustin.com. You can call the main number, which is there at 979-885-2181. If you dial extension 1, or I believe if you hit a 0 when you hear my cheery voice answer, that will take you to the front desk and they can process either your interest in coming to visit or your retail question. And then lastly, Ken was very generous talking with us in preparation for this program to say he's always looking for great history topics. I think we pitched a few to him over the last few days that have got him chomping at the bit. They're not going to be his next podcast, but they could be coming down the pipeline. So if you've got some great history suggestions, he would encourage you to send your thoughts to him at host@wiseabouttexas.com. Again, on behalf of the Texas Historical Commission, San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site, all of our stakeholders and our local friends group, the Friends of San Felipe de Austin, who host this program for us each year and help sponsor it. We want to thank you for your time tonight, and we look forward to seeing you out again soon. Thank you all.
See you later.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.